Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, friends, welcome to your UN house. Our theme today is Bhutan Climate Action. And climate action, as we all know, in Bhutan means stuff like we are the world's first carbon negative country. 72% of our country has forest coverage, which means that more than 6 million tons of carbon are absorbed by the trees. Bhutan's 24 weather stations show a rise in temperature of about 1 degree Celsius in summer and 2 degrees in winter since 2000. Let me repeat that, because statistics, it's hard sometimes for statistics to stick. Bhutan's 24 weather stations show a rise in temperature of about 1 degree Celsius in summer and 2 degrees in winter since 2000. We all know also that glacial lake outburst floods threaten Bhutan's strongly. They are a challenge. And then for those of us who have been around Thimphu for some time, we are starting to see that young people especially are using a lot more masks than they did 12 years ago. Somebody estimated that today on the streets of Thimphu around 2% of young people are wearing masks. 12 years ago, it was 0%. And one of the questions I'm hoping our colleagues on the podium today will answer is, how do we make sure we don't get to 10% in 10 years? Now is the time for us to do something about it. We do wish to, with our kids, be able to walk down Northern Lam and not feel we are in New Delhi. Our guest speaker today is Hendrik Visser from the Netherlands. He has key areas of expertise around sustainable development, climate change, water, sanitation, hygiene behaviour, agricultural development, community rural infrastructure, local governance strengthening, and local planning processes. He's currently an independent consultant, but he has worked extensively for the International Fund for Agricultural Development and the United Nations more generally. At a personal level, he inspires many people with the work he's doing through Bhutan Animal Rescue and Care, a civil society organisation which works for the happy coexistence of animals and humans in the country. Currently, they shelter 320 dogs, 12 cats, 27 macaque monkeys at their rescue centre in Yusipam. Dr. Karma Funso. Well, somebody mentioned to me recently, Dr. Karma Funso is like an onion. The more you go into the onion, the more you find out. Could it be true that he speaks 11 languages? In which case then we will all be jealous for so long into the future. And could it be that through social media platforms, as many as 1,500 people engage with him? With that, I want to say Kadinshela, Tashi Delay, and over to our host and our guest speakers today. Thank you, Kadinshela.
Well, Hendrik Visser, welcome to the 6th edition of Bhutan Dialogues. We aim this space to be a forum for civil conversations, to cultivate bold thinking, courageous speech, to ask critical questions, but with civility and humility. So we like to see this as a space where we can cultivate right speech and mindful listening. And mostly do our listening and speaking on issues of human development and progress. When I looked at your CV, you have a very strong developmental profession, from your educational training in sustainable development to what you are doing or what you have done so far. In nearly 24 countries, they directly impinge on the issue of development. And you have been, especially in Bhutan since 1997. A lot of us here were not even born, I think. A lot of the people here would be born after you came to Bhutan. So you are in a way more aware and knowledgeable about Bhutan than many young people here in Bhutan are. And you have shown up today in this wonderful go to indicate your familiarity and intimacy with Bhutan So you have a very rich life, rich career, and now you work for Bhutan Animal Rescue and Care. Can you tell us, in a summary, your background, your life going from Netherlands to Bhutan, from an engineering background to a development consultant? What brought you to where you are right now?
Well, thank you, Dr. Karma. The journey, I think the interesting thing about the journey is that you do not really know what's going to happen in your life. And at certain moments, I grew up in a construction firm. My family had a construction business, so I love to do things on the work site, to build things, to be engaged with the machines, the equipment, drive trucks. So it was quite natural for me to become a civil engineer, to really go to the civil engineering school. But at the same time, I always had I was always touched by the suffering I saw on TV of the global problems and development cooperation. So at a certain moment in my studies as a civil engineer, I started to focus more on civil engineering and how could civil engineering help other people in other countries. Because in the Netherlands, there are plenty of civil engineers and the society is quite well developed. There were not really the issues where I felt inspired to contribute to. And I wasn't necessarily inspired to set up my own business and make money out of it. I was more inspired to travel the world, so through Bangladesh and Egypt. And I realized that as an engineer, you're very narrow-minded. You have a way of thinking which is very based on your schooling. You have a problem and you have a solution. And there's very little analysis of underlying issues in terms of problems. And so during my work in Bhutan, I was much more engaged in Shenghang, with rural communities, with local schools, with local health posts. And at the end of the day, you realize it's not about my engineering knowledge which is going to make a difference. It's really how you engage with communities, how you engage with the school teachers, how you engage with the head of the school, how you engage with the engineers in the department, to make them understand that if you design something, it should be based on as much as possible local skills and local materials, and it should be maintained by communities. So how do you create sustainability? So I was very fortunate that I started working for S&D in those days, which specialized in capacity development. So it allowed me to really understand more human systems, how humans behave, why they think the way they think. And that inspired me also to do a second master's on sustainable development, which I studied more G&H and the whole G&H philosophy, and how can you bring that into practice. So the journey really started in a family where civil engineering was the core, and I'm very happy with having learned that and having become a civil engineer, but it was not my calling. And I really have been very fortunate that I have been able to shape my civil engineering background in facilitating development processes and helping communities around the world in terms of their development, and to be of service to what they need instead of me building something just for a benefit and a profit.
But of almost 24 countries you worked in, you chose Bhutan as your base now. What was that?
Yes. I met Marianne, who is better known in Bhutan as Rochiama, when she was doing her PhD in Cairo, Egypt, and I was working for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands in those days. My contract was nearly finished. I just had 3 weeks before I was leaving the country, and then I met her in a party, and yeah, the rest is history, as they say. So I stayed on, I came back, and I did some consultancy work. And Bhutan has always been very much in the public eye in the Netherlands because they had a special development relationship, so it was an intriguing country. It was really something when I read those stories, it really appealed to me as a country I would love to visit and see how that country really is. So I saw a job in Bhutan, and I applied for it, I got it, and I said to Marianne, well, shall we go? And she said, okay, I'll leave my PhD behind, and let's go, and we ended up in Shenghang. And one of the first things we did in Shenghang is rescue a dog. We saw a dog in the street, no back legs, open wounds, and well, for those who know Marianne, she is a very compassionate person who cannot stand suffering of others. So after just a few months, I guess, we had a house full of animals. when we moved to Thimphu for another job we got more animals, we had macaque monkeys. So at a certain moment you have a responsibility for these animals, which you feel, first of all, it's meaningful to stay in Bhutan and make this happen. We really have to set something up which structurally helps these animals more than emergency rescue. And of course, there is a responsibility for each individual animal. So that is basically the reason that we decided to stay in Bhutan. And basically have been allowed to stay in Bhutan. And we're very grateful for that.
Have you lost any of the initial interests you had when you were in Netherlands? Has Bhutan disillusioned you in any way? Do you still have the same degree of interest to be here?
Yeah, I think a relationship with a country is as if you have a relationship with your wife or your partner or your husband. You know, you have your honeymoon, everything is rosy, you're in love, and everything is great, and everything the other one says is so intelligent and so great. And then you have this period where you think, okay, well, that was a bit stupid of me to say, and what you're saying now is also stupid. So I think you have to redefine your relationship. You should not measure, I mean, after 20 years, you shouldn't measure where you are now, based on what your ideas were 20 years ago. So the secret is more to continuously grow together, and that's what I've done with Marianne, fortunately, and that's what I've done with Bhutan as well. I mean, the country has changed, I'm changing, I'm no longer the same person, the country is different, so you have to re-establish your relationships all over again. And I think the important part of that is that it's very much about continuously delving back into what you really appreciate, more than what you don't like, because we focus so often on what we don't like anymore, but there is so much to appreciate, and I think that's something we really have to hold on to.
Well, Bhutan Animal Rescue and Care project is a wonderful engaged compassion in action. So it's a wonderful social work you do. But your main occupation seems to be in sustainable development as a consultant. And moving now to today's theme, which is what occupies you most of the time. Tell us, for the benefit of the audience, what the climate change issue is and what is the global situation generally. When we talk about climate change, what does it really mean?
Okay. Well, I guess in climate change, roughly you have two stories. One is the big picture story of global climate change. I think all the scientific evidence has proven that because of human activity, industrialization, the way we have our lifestyles, the way we use fossil fuels, it generates greenhouse gases. And because of the greenhouse gases, they kind of form a blanket around the Earth. So the sun heats up the Earth, and in the old days, when that blanket wasn't there, the Earth radiated heat outside into the universe again. But a lot of that heat is now captured, which means that the Earth is warming up. And that is called climate change, because climate change is linked to human-induced climate change, so human activity. So there's no dispute about that. There may still be people who deny it.
Yeah, so exactly. You say there's no dispute, but then we hear about lots of climate deniers and a lot of people who are actually leading environmental think tanks who deny climate change, and people like Donald Trump, who have access to the best research findings. He denies climate change. He says global warming is a myth. So who are we to believe? So can you convince us that climate change is real on a global scale and also at the national, local level?
Okay. Well, I'm not sure if it's my role to convince. If you think about well-informed, research-based decision-making, Donald Trump may not be the best example. If you think about a lot of the research in the past and a lot of the think tanks, you should look at who finances them. There's a lot of industrial interests in ensuring that there stays confusion about climate change, because the oil industry, the car industry, they have a benefit that there are no stringent rules and regulations for exhaust of engines, that we do not use any more fossil fuels because they make profit on them. So a lot of the funding of these kind of discourse outside the mainstream facts comes from those kind of parties. Now secondly, human behavior. Why do doctors smoke? Just having facts and information doesn't necessarily change your opinion, doesn't necessarily change who you vote for. So there will always be a segment in society who have fixed ideas, who belong to a group where everybody agrees on something, so you are also always agreeing on that, even if the information you receive counters that perspective. So with these kind of people, it's no use to start a dialogue on facts. You have to approach people differently. So there is no doubt in my mind, and there's no doubt, more importantly, in the scientific world, that that climate change is human-induced and is definitely a sincere threat which we need to take seriously.
If we come to Bhutan, what are the few sort of specific examples you can give us to demonstrate that there is real climate change happening here, there is true global warming taking place?
Okay. I think some of the clearest examples, if you look at the global theater. In Europe, we had recently very low temperatures. They called it the peace from the east. Very cold weather coming from, very uncommon cold weather coming from Siberia. Last year, the east coast of the United States of America experienced similar kind of weather. You have sincere droughts in the world. And if you look at that global picture, these cold winds coming from Siberia, and here in Bhutan you had a cold spell as well for several weeks, which caused quite a few deaths in South Nepal, in North India and Bangladesh, because those populations are not used to those kind of cold weather. So you can say that these cold fronts of cold weather moving over the earth, these ones come from the fact that the winds which are circling around the North Pole keep the warmer weather from the rest of the earth away, so that the North Pole stays cold. But if these winds actually become less strong, a lot of the warm weather from the rest of the earth infiltrate in the North Pole. So what you see this year is that it's the warmest winter ever recorded on the North Pole. A lot of the ice is melting, and much faster than was predicted in all these climate models. It doesn't only mean that warm temperatures go into the North Pole, it also means that those winds no longer maintain the cold temperatures in the North Pole, and some of that wind then goes through Siberia to Europe. So that infiltrates, and that kind of affects our weather patterns here as well. So the cold spell a few weeks ago is very uncommon. Now those cold spells may have happened in the past as well, but they will definitely become more frequent, and they may last for much longer. So the scenarios are, one way, a very gradual increase of temperatures. So the ecosystems, the forest will slowly dry out because there's more evaporation. At the same time, the shifting rain in Bhutan will mean that farmers can no longer depend on a fixed date when the monsoon is coming. So their agricultural practices are hampered. They run the risk of losing their seeds if they plant too early and the rain is not coming. But they also risk their crop if they actually plant too late. So it becomes more risky for local farmers to plant because the predictability of the rainfall is increasing. And in the past, what you definitely see in the whole Himalaya area is that more or less the same amount of rain is falling, but it's falling in a much shorter period of time. So you cannot utilize that water. There's a lot of very heavy rainfalls, but that doesn't infiltrate in the soil. You have erosion, it goes into the rivers, you have flash floods, you have your hydropower which is damaged. So the changes in the weather have a severe impact on local livelihoods. And in the long term, for Bhutan especially, you see already a lot of proof with research of retreating glaciers. Now glaciers are a major source of the river flow in Bhutan, on which you depend economically with hydropower. So there are substantial large-scale challenges for Bhutan, and there are also at a very practical level with the rural communities and farmers, very practical challenges in terms of adapting to climate change. And of course, the newspapers talk about houses which have the roofs blown off by severe winds. That is going to increase. Those kind of events will be normal in future. It will no longer be an exception. So how do you help communities protect themselves again? If they build their roof the same way as they built it in the past, it's still not going to withstand the next one. So it's really important to understand the global dynamics in climate change and how that will affect Bhutan, because Bhutan, even though it has been isolated for so long, it cannot isolate itself from the rest of the world, and specifically not for the climate and the changes in the climate in the world.
So that leads me to ask you another question now, again taking the role of a devil's advocate here. When climate change is something that is global, beyond boundaries, beyond political borders, and that big countries, big carbon emitters like the US and other countries are not committing to it as much as Bhutan is doing, aren't our people making sacrifices for the global benefit? And would actually the size of sacrifice we make in a tiny country turn around the global warming scenario? In other words, wouldn't our Bhutanese efforts go in vain if the rest of the world doesn't work together? So is our sacrifice worth it?
Let me first answer that question from a more philosophical perspective. Gross national happiness is all about generosity and compassion. It's not about you, it's about what you do for society as a whole after you have also taken care of yourself. But taking care of yourself means also taking care of society at large. So whether it's a real sacrifice if you have compassion and generosity to your neighbor or to the global community, I would not call that a sacrifice. I would say it's more a responsibility to lead, because you see how you can contribute to stopping this problem by changing people's minds. Now, it is true that the benefit from this industrialization, which is a large part of causing global warming, the benefit of that is the industrialization is largely absorbed by the rich countries, the Western countries. That's why they are financing these global funds to have smaller countries like Bhutan adapt to the consequences of climate change. So Bhutan is generating a lot of income from global funds and big projects, millions and millions and millions of dollars, to adapt to climate change, because the national community, the international community globally accepts their responsibility. Now, more importantly, mitigating climate change and adapting to climate change means that you're more careful with when you drive your car. Maybe you should take an electrical car, that you don't throw your waste out of the window, but you're careful about your waste. You don't use plastic. You're careful about your lifestyle. You may not need the newest iPhone. You may not need a new T-shirt every week. So this consumeristic model, which is now the development model of the world, in principle, everything you need to do to mitigate or adapt to climate change are common sense, good things for yourself, for your community, for the world. So what do we have to lose?
So it makes economic sense also to take climate action here. Let me agree with you for once. I'm convinced, in fact, that climate change is affecting lives of people here. And I come from a very high valley in Bhutan, Ura. We don't have glaciers feeding our streams. We are quite very rich natural water tables, so we have streams flowing in all directions. But suppose the global warming and climate change leads to droughts, where we don't have our regular monsoons for, say, a year or more. Where would we get our drinking water from? Is a frightening idea or a fear I have. And the same, I think, as we look at Bangladesh's water levels rising, and how that, I was told, would make Bangladesh lose a huge percentage of their landmass and lead to millions of refugees. Bhutan being quite close to Bangladesh, there's no doubt there will be some spillover of these refugees. So when you look at such scenarios, which it seems is going to be quite likely in 20 years, how do we deal with these problems? What can we do today to, if not fully overcome, at least delay these problems? So what kind of tips would you have for people in my village, for instance? Apart from being responsible consumers, what are some of the pragmatic climate action they can take up to deal with this?
One of the challenges is that if you talk about the big picture, it really looks as if you can't solve it. It's demotivating. So I think what is really important is to create stories around climate change which actually inspire you. Now, when I designed one of the programs here in Bhutan, we went to Phukchika Valley and we talked to the farmers and said, so what is changing in Bhutan? How does climate change impact you? And then you have the stories about Phukchika, the wetland where the black-necked cranes are. They say we have a lot more pests which are attacking our crops, because the number of days that we have frost, the number of days that we have snow cover is decreasing. So there is a lot more eggs and insects which survive. So they are really attacking our crops. So then you start to think, how can I help? What can we do? And that's where you have to tap into. I mean, yes, we may have to vote in a way that we have parties who represent our views on climate change and environment. But more importantly, we can help our neighbor. We can help the people in Fukushima. We can help the people in Shengang, because they are suffering right now. And it makes no sense to me that we only start talking about how do we adapt to climate change in the coming 4 or 5 years. These people are suffering from the changes in the climate already right now. So what are we doing? How can we do that? So the first thing you have to start changing is yourself. If you don't need fast food chips from India and you eat local, you save on transport, you save on pollution. If you buy an electrical car, or if you push your government in getting electrical buses, you know, that's where your action can be, that's where your community in action can be. So I wouldn't focus on the big picture. Yeah? Think about the big picture, because you want to influence that. But definitely think about how you can help that farmer in Fukushima. How do you help a farmer which is 3 or 4 days walking away from the nearest roadside? And what can we do? What can you do? How can you exercise your compassion? And trust me, it's not a duty, it's a gift. If you can be compassionate to others, you get back so much happiness, you get so much reward in your life. Next to the suffering you feel, yeah? But we have to deal with that suffering, because otherwise there is anyway no happiness.
So much of the answer that you're providing has to do with consumer education, of being a responsible, sustainable consumer. I think on an individual level you could educate them to sort of take such climate actions. You mentioned earlier how Bhutan has benefited from climate funds for all the environmental conservation efforts we have made. But then I've also heard from you that a lot of the climate projects we have here are tied to specific projects, that we haven't managed to develop a sustainable, pervasive culture of sort of climate action in the institutions. So how do we go about dealing with the institutions, especially state institutions that receive these funds, to make climate action as part of the ethos of their administration, rather than just have a sort of a fund-type project, one at a time? What do you think can change in the administrative and the governance system here to make climate action part and parcel of our governance?
I think the big challenge about large projects is that they are largely designed for accountability to the big funders, the big agencies who give you the funding. And it takes a lot of effort to design these projects to strengthen and build your national systems, your national planning systems, your national public financial management systems. So it is very important for the government to realize that whenever they have funding, it should not just be money for more things at the local level. It should also be an opportunity to use these projects to really strengthen the capacity of the government system. Now, if you look at the guidelines for the 12th Five-Year Plan, the CCC is all about collaboration and coordination and consolidation. So the government wants to focus on making things sustainable. What is the use of building a farm road if nobody can use it because it falls apart? There's no maintenance budget, there's no transport. So the focus should no longer be on input. The focus should be on how does this help the rural community? And farm roads are very important, but they're only important if actually there is a taxi plying, there's a bus service, and people can make use of it. So it is a link between how the government system is becoming more effective, gets more resources, but also becomes more efficient. So the government has to collaborate with the people. Democracy has been gifted to the Bhutanese citizens, so they transferred from beneficiaries to citizens. But democracy is not just voting every now and then. It's about coming together, discussing issues, having your own opinions, looking at the discourse. What is the government saying? What is the bureaucracy saying? Do I agree with that? How about this opinion? So it is very important that the governance system creates space for civil society, where discussions take place. There should be an acknowledgement that expertise and knowledge is not invested only in agencies and departments. There is a lot of knowledge and insights in society itself. So the big challenge is, coming from a history of a feudal system, how do we reverse the mindset that government is not giving you development, leading your development. Government is actually facilitating community development. How can you turn from an agent, an extension agent, which has certain knowledge which you have to transfer to farmers? How can we translate that into, I'm here to facilitate your development. What do you have? What are your problems? What can you do yourself? Great that you can do that yourself. Where do you need me? What can we do to help you develop yourself? giving the responsibility for development back to the citizens. And I think that's where civil society has a very key role to play, and is, I think, still undervalued in Bhutan. If you look at the G&H Center, that's an organization who knows how to create inner happiness, how to make a reflective process for people to think about what makes me happy, how can I change my lifestyle, how can I be more resilient, because part of climate change is being more resilient. What does that mean? Resilience means being able to get over certain challenges, being able to deal with things in a way that you can talk about with your neighbor. You have a reflective capacity. So I think creating space for citizens to form their own opinion, changing towards facilitating development instead of delivering development, and really emphasizing the role of civil society. I think that is going to be key to build community resilience to climate change. Because then communities can say, okay, we have agriculture, smart agriculture, sustainable land management practices. Yeah, we have to prevent erosion. We have to have terraces. The little rain which falls needs to be absorbed by the ground. It should not just flush down the slopes with erosion. Only 1% of the R&R budget, agriculture budget, went to sustainable land management practices. Yeah, which is very minimal for a threat to the agricultural sector, which has a big magnitude, where slopes are so vulnerable. So if communities would be more in charge, I need this from agriculture, and I would like to have this from the health, yeah, because Bhutan has a great system of free health services, free education services. Yeah, but would it not be great if students can have more input into what kind of things they want to learn and how they want to learn? Yeah, that it's not just facts, but that we actually make them reflective citizens. I think that is a long run where Bhutan has everything it needs to take action.
Well, that is also the objective of Bhutan Dialogues, to make reflective thinking, critical-minded citizens. It seems from what you say that we need a great deal of citizens' engagement, citizens' participation in governance. But to a large extent, don't we also see that a lot of these climate change-related efforts take place when there is money in it? And when there is no money, people often withdraw, drop the projects. And that really makes us question, are we really convinced and committed to climate action? How can we make the citizens feel the urgency that we have to act now to avoid all the calamities in the future? What kind of message? You have worked in so many communities. Can you give a few examples of success stories? Both projects you found personally very fulfilling and projects that had a great impact on the communities. Can you share some experience if you have?
Okay. I think the interesting thing about your question is that it reminds me about some of the articles in the Kunsel. I think if you read the Kunsel, it's very interesting to not just read the article, but also analyze that article from a perspective of what does that mean for society. So, for example, recently there was an article about complaints that people had to wait for several hours before they got their gas bottle. And I was thinking, what would be the story of somebody who lives in Kachimo, Bardo? That person will be so happy if he would only have to wait for a few hours to get a gas bottle. So it is extremely important that we create stories about the diversity in this country, that we don't focus only on, okay, there is a problem about gas bottles. And what does that mean for the majority of the people in Bhutan? And I think that's where journalists, media have an important role to play. That's why citizens' engagement is so important, because that's where we can mix these different realities. Because the people who live in the rural Bhutan have a very different life than what we think. Traffic congestion is really not an issue for them. Yeah, but it seems to be very high on the agenda, because urban voters pressurize politicians who all live in the urban centers, yeah, to make it an issue. So I think the great important thing in Bhutan is that we need citizens and civil society, informal or formal, to develop those kind of stories. So, well, as it is, for example, the National Women's Day today, I was in Shemgang for a program to look at an assessment of climate vulnerabilities with the communities there. So we had an analysis of climate change impacts on their livelihoods. What do they depend on? And of course, water sources, agriculture, all the typical rural livelihood elements. So we made an assessment of what are the priorities. If the government would provide you with funding, what would you finance with that funding? What would be your priorities? So we had one group with the male representative, Tsokpas, and we had one group with the women. And you have two completely different plans. Yes, they cover all the elements, but the women were much more concerned about water. Because they are responsible to get water for the household, they're responsible to give it to the cow, they're responsible for cleanliness of the children, they're responsible for the health of the children. So you can see how important it is to, even if you think about a rural community, to understand the underlying diversity. If you think about a household, to understand the gender roles and responsibilities. So that's an example where I feel all your extension agents, all your GAOC offices should have these kind of tools and facilitate development. Let people think, because this was not, the issue is not so much that I then can write down what the women said and I can write down what the men said. They were discussing outside after this workshop. Gosh, I never realized that this was so important for you. So apart from getting better ideas, they started to have a discussion amongst themselves, and they come to what they feel is then the best prioritization. So the tools of participatory tools, facilitating people's development, allows them to, empowers them to act. Instead of waiting for the GAOC office to come and say, okay, this is how we're going to help you, they can do it all themselves. So the empowering part is so important for climate resilience. The social network, the understanding that if your neighbor is angry, he may not be angry to you at you. So give him some time, reflect on that. If your neighbor is suffering, how can you help him? And I think traditionally in Bhutan that has been very strong, those social relationships. The Tsokpa system, the helping each other. And I think the way of development, we have to create a discourse, we have to tell the story, how important and valuable that is. That is not old-fashioned. That is actually what has to happen in the rest of the world, and that should be built on. It's not about me driving a big Prado, it's about what I do for my community. And I think Bhutan has an awful lot of wisdom and value in that still, which should not be lost. So ensuring that the governance system creates citizen participation, reflective practice, is really important for climate resilience.
Yeah, thank you for bringing up the women's issues here. I mean, today is International Women's Day, and both of us sitting here, I think we are very staunch supporters of gender parity. So even if there's no women here as a guest, don't feel that we have not considered this day any less significant. But what I get from you talking about, you often diverge to rural development, and then we brought up the issue of how women actually are going to be the first sort of victims of climate change because of their relationship to water resources and agricultural work. And we now know that the women are the main economic players in rural parts of Bhutan. So there's definitely a very strong link between climate action and women. And when we look at climate action, especially in how people make decisions, how people participate in formulating policies and plans, there is still lack of female representation. Female representation is very low, both at the national and perhaps also at local sort of GAOC and village decision-making processes. How do we go about empowering women, as you put it? How do we go about allocating more space to women to share their voices, their opinions? Have you worked in other countries where this was also a problem and they found a solution? A very smart way of bringing women on board very quickly.
Solutions.
Any examples? Well, if you don't have an example, that's okay.
I think there's one example, but it's not about solving the big picture. So it's about how you change your own mindset. I think for those young men under you who do not yet have a relationship, choose a woman who is strong and has her own mind. That's the best thing you can do to develop and to a nice person. And I know that out of practice. So I think what you need to understand is that once you grow up, you have a specific idea about what women are, what men are, and how, if you have a relationship, how you should act and behave in that relationship. And usually after the honeymoon is over, you'll find out it doesn't work like that, and you're rather depressed because she's not doing exactly what you thought she was supposed to do, and you're filling in that image you have in your mind of how a relationship should be, but it doesn't work like that. The important thing in a relationship is that you can talk about those things. Because you have always expectations which have nothing to do with the reality, has nothing to do with the other, and those are just conditioned relationship ideas. So really, if you look at a role model in my life, then Marianne is definitely one where I sincerely admire her honesty and her reflections, even if they definitely have hurt me over the years. They have always come out of love and kindness and care, because if you care about somebody, you have to be reflective with that person. Because if you see a pattern in somebody else, in your wife or in your girlfriend, which is destructive, or she's doing things and you don't know why, talk about it. So if you change your own mind about how you look at women, and that you don't say, well, women, yeah, they're nice, they're kind, they're friendly, they don't say nasty things because they are linked to the idea you have of your mother. That's where gender change starts. No, women can be strong, they can make decisions, they can be tough, and they can also be compassionate, yes. But we can also be compassionate, we can also be kind, we can also be caring as men, and that doesn't take anything away from our malehood. So in the relationships with your family and your girlfriend, and the other way around, don't get stuck in those patterns. Don't get stuck in how it's supposed to be because society thinks it is like that. In these exercises I talked about with communities about what women want and what men want. That's where afterwards you have the discussion. Okay, but why is that so important for you? Well, because I am spending 8 hours a day getting water from there and doing this and doing this and doing this, while you are actually sitting there doing nothing. That's the kind of things we have to do, because these men sit in their office thinking that they do everything, and they come home and they say, well, I had such a tough day. You have been nicely lying outside in the sun and you haven't done anything. So where's my dinner? So I think that's where the change in gender roles start. And yes, of course, you can have systems, you can have gender budgeting, you can look at courses, etc. But start in your own life. Yeah? Think about how you look at women. And how can you change that in your relationships which have value to you?
Thank you. That is a wonderful message on International Women's Day. You sort of preempted my question about who inspires you. You already mentioned Miriam inspires you. But given the current global climate change scenario, with ocean levels rising, global temperature rising, polar ice melting, all that, sometimes we become defeated. We lose hope. So I was going to ask you, what do you do, or who do you look up to keep that optimism going, to have that hope, to get inspiration?
I think there are a lot of people who inspire me, and in different ways. I don't necessarily have heroes, per se. I don't believe in heroes in the way we create heroes in society, because as soon as you like something in somebody, you feel, oh, that's great that this person is doing. We're putting that person on a pedestal, and he's extraordinary. So we absolve ourselves from any responsibility to act in the same way as this person. So in that sense, I don't like talking about heroes. What I indeed like about role models, I think if you look at the global space, Al Gore is inspiring because after his defeat in the presidential race, he found his real calling. Yeah, and he said, I'm going to be, or let's say, I want to be a global leader to promote the message of climate change. And he has had a great success at his level in politics to send a message in an accessible way, to make it interesting for people to look at, to make movies. And I think that's the kind of inspiration you need. You have your life planned out. You think, oh, I want to be the president. That doesn't happen. And then you reflect and say, you know, maybe that's actually not something I really wanted. And you could go somewhere else. Nelson Mandela, when it comes to justice, how you can be a compassionate person after suffering so much from a system of oppression, how you can actually not fall into the trap of becoming a bully because you've been bullied, but actually to be generous, caring, and be a president who wants to lift the country as a whole out of it. The Guardian website has over 2017 monitored how many environmental activists have been killed in 2017, 4 per week. So those are people, those are community people who stand up for something they truly believe in is important for them and the community. They stand up against government, they stand up against big business, they stand up against mafia and criminal activity, because they believe that they have to take a choice, they have to take a stand against these kind of damaging activities to the community. And they pay a price for it. And those are role models for me, because it means you can stand up to something. And who am I? I mean, I'm sitting here in a luxury chair, talking in a safe distance. There's nobody pointing guns at me. I mean, I can go back home, and if everything goes well, Marianne has dinner ready. You know, so what kind of risk do I have? Nothing. So I think those are role models. And I'd certainly put Marianne there, because she acts out of compassion. And she always brings me down, because I'm, you know, a high flyer and blah, 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 and blah, blah, and we have to do a long-term blah, blah. Yes, so and what are we going to do about this dog here? Yeah, and that's the kind of people you need around you. Not the ones who say yes, 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 blah, 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 blah. No, the ones who say yes, that's very nice, and we can talk about that, what we want to do next week, but it's also important what you're going to do right now. And I think balancing those two is very important, because where you want to go next week will dictate what you do right now. But if you don't do anything right now, then it's no need to talk what you want to do in 2 weeks, because 2 weeks will be then right now.
Well, thank you. So, I mean, we talked about people's engagement and participation. So right now, I'm going to open it to the floor and make people participate. So, any question from the audience?
This topic is very relevant to our country, climate change. Think globally and act locally. So it's time the country is acting very locally. So I just wanted to ask, in which sector our country should focus, from service sector to agriculture sector to industry sector? If it's industry sector, for the economic growth of our country, which technology is to be used, like eco technology and so on. So which would be the suitable technology for our country? Despite having the electric car, as not much of people have brought electric car in our country. Few people have brought electric car. Everybody having a pure diesel car. So which sectors, technology that is suitable for our country? Thank you very much.
I think what you need to keep in mind is that when you talk about services, you first of all have to acknowledge that Bhutan is still largely a self-sufficient agricultural society. So your technology should help farmers adapting to climate change and being able to maintain their livelihoods in those rural areas. So there is a lot of technology which can help there. If you talk about climate smart agriculture, if you talk about soil fertility, if you talk about the catching rain and keeping that rain in the soil, you have mobile apps with some easy testing kits which can tell you exactly how much fertilizer do you need on this soil. Yeah? What can you grow best on this soil? So allowing technology to help your rural population, to rural farmers, is I think, a key entry point. And again, the challenge is that it's all very low-tech, and it's not very big, and people like big projects. So technology should help Bhutan to sustain its, well, I would say, carbon neutrality, even though because Bhutan is carbon negative because of a heritage of forest, a heritage which goes back into the decisions of benevolent kings. So if you're born into a wealthy family, can you just do whatever you like because you are rich? Or do you feel we need to be responsible, we need to be sustainable? How I deal with that wealth? Because you can say, well, we're carbon negative, but then you do whatever kind of development you want because you have such a big forest. No, I think you have to be very careful and value and appreciate that gift to the nowadays society. So I think, yes, you need to look much more integrated at electrical vehicles, electrical bus systems. You need to have all infrastructure in place. You need to design your urban centers from that perspective. Yeah? So sustainable urban development is really going to be very important. And that's not happening. If you look at Wangmi New Town, you know, those are engineers who looked at it. And I can say that because I am one. There was no town planner involved. There was, well, maybe an engineer town planner. There were no people involved in architecture. Your building codes are for earthquake security, which is very important. But how about energy efficiency? Yeah? So I think in terms of technology, you really have to say what are your key areas where you want to focus on. And I think urban development, minimizing exhaust from cars, really promoting with subsidies and infrastructure, electrical vehicles, electrical buses, because that's where you really have a say as a government or as a Trombe. Those are really areas where I feel you can invest in.
Now, can I ask a follow-up question? You have been involved in green roads projects, so environment-friendly roads building through SLB. Has Bhutan really reached a stage where we are building roads responsibly and sustainably with concern for the environment, or are we still lagging? Where's the technology and the practice right now?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. Let me answer that question by not answering it. When I did women's studies at university, one of the interesting studies you find on emancipation in the West, gender, is that male engineers developed the vacuum cleaner because they said women spend so much time dusting the house, so we should invent something which helps them to spend less time on cleaning the house. So they invented the vacuum cleaner. But then these same men increased their standard of cleanliness of the house. So the women spend as much time cleaning, because the standard of the expectation of cleanliness increased. And it's a bit the same with environmental friendly road construction. I think an awful lot has happened and an awful good things have achieved, but people don't realize it anymore because there are very little people who know 17 years ago how roads were constructed. So yes, a lot needs to be done. Yes, and a lot can be done. But there has been major achievements in new road designs. In the old days, there was a bulldozer. They threw everything down. There are hundreds of meters down the road, the forest was damaged. There was no tree left. Huge landslides, huge damages to the forest above the road. It still happens because you're building roads in a mountainous area which is fragile. But a lot has been achieved. And can there be more? Yes, definitely. Should there be more? Yes. But we should also celebrate what has been achieved.
Thank you.
Bhutan is very much affected by climate change, and given the condition, geographical condition of the country, there is gravity because we are on the Himalayas, and given the fact that the climate is changing, there are a lot of rains, erratic rainfall, monsoon patterns are changing. From that perspective, also you mentioned about government investing very less on sustainable land management in the country. From these scenarios, what are the things as an individual that we can try to talk with the government, convince the government that they should invest a good amount of resources in this sector?
Well, as a citizen, your natural way of expressing your voice is by your votes. But then also I think you could engage in discussion groups, publicize certain papers on certain issues to influence government decision making. Now, I think the great opportunity you would have is that it's a bit what you asked about projects, which are running a bit parallel to the government system. Are they really building capacity? If you look at some of the major projects in agriculture, under the International Fund of Agriculture Development, there is a lot of innovation. There's a lot of good practice. There are models of how government engages with communities which are novel. There are outreach ways, because you cannot expect an extension agent in Mumbai to visit every year 5,000 farms for vaccination of cows. So you need to have lead farmers. Who in this community, how can we organize the farmers? How can they organize themselves? Who is the lead farmer who can communicate what we need, what kind of facilitation we need? So you have to think about how you can create a organization at the level which engages with the government, which can be more demanding the kind of services. So those kind of good practices are in projects. The problem is they're not mainstreamed in the government system. If the project ends, it's a great document, we have great publications, we have a website, everything closes down, it goes in the drawer, it's locked, and that's it. Until the next project comes, and then we start all over again. And I think that's where the government is weak. The government does not realize that it has to change the way it works. And absorb new ways of working from good practice from these projects. Because it's always captured in a project. So your engagement with the government is asking questions on prime ministers, question hours. Yeah? Talking to journalists, organizing a discussion group in your school, organizing a discussion group in a cafe, and say, well, you know, I think this is something which is really interesting. Who else is interested in this? Yeah?
I'm interested in many aspects of climate action. I would have to say the road links with Punsoling, between Thimphu and Punsoling, strike me as vulnerable. I think many of us are aware of the vulnerability of this. Really, it's the main archery into our country around Rinchim-Ding. It's remarkably fragile. That whole belt in the south of Bhutan, remarkably fragile geography going on there. I would have to say that we've noticed, many of us over the last year or so, that some of the hydro stations got pushed back simply because there's been a shift in mountains. So there's a number of multiple factors that could have a mega impact that are kind of related to climate action. Which are the ones that at that level of magnitude that would be on your radar screen, or let's call it, be specific, your radar screen of concern?
Okay, all of them. But then I care, so I guess, I think the interesting thing is that if you look at collaboration amongst agencies or government agencies, emergencies are usually the time and place where people actually come together who have to do something. If there is an emergency in the village comes together. So the urgency to address a specific issue can be a catalyst to really create also future collaboration to address these more slow oncoming type of climate change impacts. I think let me phrase it like this. If you would have a scenario in Bhutan with a major cyclone in the Gulf of Bengal, which strikes over the whole east coast of India and then comes up to the mountains. We've had several in the past, yeah, but let's say it's 5 times as big as that one. We have huge rainfall. Road to Funchling is closed to many places. The East Highway is closed. Some of your hydropower are washed away. Some of the intakes. Major hailstorms, exactly at the moment that you have your crops in the field. So your rural communities in part of the country have no food anymore. Yeah? Major rains which have washed away a lot of the water sources which are not well protected. So all of a sudden you have a situation where your infrastructure is no longer working, electricity may not work, some of your towers of your mobile network may have gone. You cannot access these communities. Now the way of thinking is often, we'll ask our big neighbor, our big brother India for help. But as we have seen in the last cyclone, they're pretty occupied in India. They don't have helicopters available. They don't have rice rations anymore because they have, in the scale of India, millions of people are already suffering. So I think the urgency to address climate change from an emergency perspective needs to get much more attention. And I think from that urgency of an emergency, we should also say we have to invest much more in communities maintaining our forests, our watersheds, maintaining the areas above roads with replantations, bioengineering, so that we stabilize these slopes. So if rural communities are suffering from climate change, why not give them income opportunities in terms of road maintenance? Yeah? So we have to be much more interested in thinking how can we engage with communities for them to have a benefit in terms of actions which also safeguard our major infrastructure. So I think that is the urgency which at this moment is not really felt in Bhutan, unless you start talking about what I just said, this is an emergency, how do you deal with it? And then everybody says, oh yes, gosh. And then after the weekend it's forgotten again and we go back to normal business.
From the many pressing issues around environmental conservation, such as emission of impurity into the air and water, polluting the most pristine natural resources, the other issue that keeps disturbing me is the loss of natural and cultural resources for the development and economic reasons. As much as we feel urgency to protect our environment and natural resources, the need for economic development
is felt even more urgently to help achieve the goal of economic self-sufficiency, to elevate poverty and so on and so forth. So with these two equal, crucially important needs, I feel the way forward for Bhutan is a little confusing. So Hendrik, with your long experience in Bhutan and also as a development consultant, how would you see the current trend in Bhutan? Or in other words, how would you assess the current trend, the economic development versus environmental conservation in Bhutan? Thank you.
Thank you. Those are not easy questions to answer, Georgie. Because there are many elements to it. I think what we need to understand is that I am really inspired by gross national happiness. And I think it's a bit sad to see how the concept and the philosophy of gross national happiness in Bhutan is judged by how society functions right at this moment. Because it's not fair. It is a guiding principle. It's an inspiration for the future. It's an inspiration where we want to go. And we are never behaving the way we think we should behave. Yeah, our own actions are never fully in line with what we believe in our ethics and our values. Yeah, we still do sometimes stupid things, and we still say things which are not very nice and hurt other people, even if we know that we should not do that. So the way society functions at this moment is a factor of history, is a factor of all kinds of influences. And I think we really have to stick to gross national happiness in Bhutan, because it is an inspiration, and it is the only way to shape a society where people have enough of everything they need. And I think that is core. The economic model in the world is not based on producing enough for what everybody needs. The economic model in the world is built on producing as much as we can and sell it to people because that's what you think you need. Yeah? So we're selling things which are useless. We're selling things which are not creating any substantial improvement of our livelihood. It's damaging to our health. So I think you have to be very careful in terms of your national policies and your laws to really think about what do you want to have in terms of the development. And I think your cultural identity is really important. And I think if you want to capitalize on GNH, maintaining a country which is compassionate and kind to foreigners who visit, but to be realistic and say, well, yeah, this is not a dream country. This is not Hungary. I know people in the outside world are looking for this one place where true happiness exists because they can't find it in their own life. So we always look somewhere else for that true happiness. And I think we have to find happiness in ourselves, and then only we can see the happiness in the rest of the world. So I think we have to balance those two. Economic development, yes, but environmental safeguard, thinking about climate resilience, and why not investing in better education, investing in good health, investing in water sanitation, hygiene behavior, that has huge rates of return. Factors 8, factors 9, often much more return than big projects in industrialization. So why do we always think that we need to have big projects for economic development? No, invest in your people, invest in good water, good sanitation, hand washing practices. That pays back 8-10 times your investment. So I would say if you think about the economy, invest in your people, and it will come back in your economy. Similarly for education.
I think there is a great need here in Bhutan to really revise and change our own life expectations, life goals. That even the environmental conservation efforts that we put in is an effort towards sustainable economy. That if we don't really develop responsibly, we are going to lose in the future. And there is, I think, a lot more need in Bhutan for people to appreciate that small is beautiful, that contentment, a very important principle in the Buddhist heritage, should be lived. I think there is much more of such spiritual internal education to be done, and also perhaps people should look more holistically and see economy and environment as polarizing factors. Let me ask you my final question. Bhutan Dialogues always offers our guests 2 books from the international New York Times International Bestsellers list.
Yes.
So my question is, which two titles did you choose and why?
Okay.
If you have chosen already.
Yes, I thank you actually for that opportunity, because the interesting thing is you start to think, what would I actually want to read? Yeah, and I think it's an opportunity to engage your mind with something which you had in the past already thought about, but it never really worked like that. And I think it's also why it's great fun to be here, because in the end, I don't necessarily think that what my ideas are or what I say is important. I hope that some of it may trigger some ideas, think, oh, that's interesting to look into, what is interesting to explore. So I hope that you will have some inspiration, as I've had by many of the people I've met in my life and many of the things I read, inspiration to explore, to wonder, to be curious. So your question about the books, there's one book I choose which is called Other Minds, which is The Octopus, the Sea, and the Deep Origins of Consciousness. Now the reason I choose that book is, first of all, because I'm interested about consciousness. What does that mean? Where does that house in my body? How do I evolve my consciousness towards enlightenment if I would be happy? But the interesting thing about this book, it actually explores the consciousness, the awareness of octopuses, which are extremely clever, intelligent, wise species. And we often look at animals with a projection of, well, they're stupid and they're not intelligent, they can't do anything. Yeah, but they're sentient beings, and the word sentient beings exists for a reason. And octopuses are very wise. If you read the research about what they are able to do and not, well, actually you wonder why nature has invested in such a big brain if their lifespan is so short. So I'm really intrigued to link my quest for understanding consciousness and myself by also reflecting more on animals and our perceptions on animals. And of course that comes also from living with animals has definitely changed my mind. I live no longer in the illusion that the human species is superior to anything around us. That's just because it makes us feel good. Once you get rid of that superiority, you realize that your life will be a lot easier and a lot more compassionate, and you'll have a lot more happiness because you're actually open to the engagement with animals around you who give you happiness, are very generous in their social expression to you. So absorb that, enjoy that. So that's the first book. Now the second book.
Wonderful.
The second book is I tend to be sometimes a bit serious because I care, and I know that therefore it's never good enough. There's always a quest to do more, and it exhausts me. So I thought, let me also try to get a book which is a little bit more on the humoristic side. So I've opted for a classic which is What a Carve Up, which is about the 70s period in the United Kingdom, the politics, the conservative government. It actually presents a rich family and how they deal with the plebs, the local population. And it's really well written in terms of expressing how rich and wealthy, in all their ignorance, think they're superior to other people. And it's written in a way that it is supposed to make me laugh. So I'm looking forward to that. But at the same time, the interesting thing for me would also be that if you look at the ongoing discussions in the United Kingdom on Brexit, you can mirror what happened in the 70s again to what happens now. Politicians are not. Those politicians are not interested in a common good. They're interested in their own career and convincing people that they're right about their own ignorance. And I thought it would be a good idea, instead of reading on Brexit with a depressed face, to read something which actually will make me smile again.
Thank you very much. I think that brings us to the conclusion of the dialogue today. I do hope that the audience will come here, as well as those who would watch us on YouTube or through other media platforms, will take two messages home: that climate change is real, and that we must do something in our own individual ways to cope with it, to counteract it. And often, in fact, it's not often, I regularly end the session with a traditional Bhutanese piece of wisdom. I didn't manage to find one today, but I didn't have time to look for one, but The other week, I was reading the biography of Gato Situchuki Jamso, a Tibetan Lama who lived towards the end of the 19th and beginning of 20th century, whose incarnation happens to be Bhutanese prince now. And in his travelogue, he went on a long pilgrimage in central Tibet, and he arrived at a place called Gangri Thokar, the snow white peak that's associated with Longchenpa. And when he looked at the peak, he saw much less snow than he expected. And he passed a remark and goes, Jagar Ongwe Jela Cheba Pilalep. It translates roughly, it's an impromptu translation. After India, now India here is a metaphor for industrialization. After India arrives, the heat will reach Tibet. So I suppose it's some kind of a prophetic remark that he made about 100 years ago. So with that, I wish you a good evening. Join us again next month, second Thursday. And thank you very much, Hendrik, for joining us.
Thank you, Dr. Karma.